In the remote wilderness of the Cascade Mountains, a seasoned hiker was about to take a path he never intended. What started as a routine solo trek through dense evergreen forests took a chilling turn when his compass spun wildly, pulling him toward an unknown destination. Ethan Calloway wasn't your typical adventurer. For years, he had built a career as an investigative journalist, charting dangerous expeditions and uncovering the forgotten stories of the world's most treacherous landscapes. Known for his relentless curiosity and unwavering instincts, he had always trusted his survival skills to keep him safe. When his compass malfunctioned, pointing him toward an unmarked path, he had no idea he was walking into a mystery that had been buried for centuries. Against his better judgment, he followed, a decision that would lead to the discovery of a long-lost expedition and something far more unsettling lurking beneath the earth. What began as a personal escape into the wild would become a descent into an ancient secret, one that refused to stay buried. The Cascade Mountains would never be the same after what Ethan uncovered in the depths of its forgotten history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the towering first as Ethan Calloway adjusted the straps on his pack and took his first step into the Cascade Mountains. The dense evergreen wilderness swallowed him almost immediately, dampening the sounds of the outside world until only his own breath and the distant calls of unseen birds remained. This was what he came for. Solitude. The quiet that let him exist without expectation, without memory clawing at the edges of his mind. Out here, no one asked about the past. No one whispered his name like an epitaph. The narrow dirt trail beneath, his boots was well worn, but he had no plans to follow it for long. He was an experienced hiker, a former adventure journalist who had spent years documenting expeditions into the world's most unforgiving landscapes. He trusted his instincts, his gear, and the state-of-the-art digital compass strapped to his wrist. The route was plotted, his supplies meticulously chosen. There would be no mistakes this time. He paused at a ridge, pulling out his satellite phone. The reception was spotty, but a single bar flickered in the upper corner of the screen. Good enough. He pressed the call button. After 2 rings, his younger brother Jacob's voice crackled through. "You better not be calling to tell me you changed your mind." Ethan huffed a dry laugh. "Nope, just checking in." "You're alive, that's good," Jacob said. "For now. Still on schedule. I should be at the next waypoint by nightfall." He scanned the valley below. Deep green stretching for miles, broken only by rocky outcroppings and distant snow-capped peaks. It was beautiful, isolated, just what he needed. Jacob hesitated before speaking again. "You sure this is the best idea, E, going off the grid alone?" Ethan adjusted the strap on his shoulder. "You know me, not much for crowds." "That's not what I'm talking about." Ethan exhaled sharply. "I need this, Jake." Another pause. "I know." Silence settled between them for a moment. Unspoken things thick in the air. The memory they never talked about. A ledge. A misstep. A friend who never made it home. "All right," Jacob finally said, voice lighter. "Just don't go chasing any ghosts out there." "No promises," Ethan muttered before ending the call. He tucked the phone away and checked his compass. The screen displayed his coordinates in crisp, glowing numbers, the arrow pointing exactly where it should. Satisfied, he took another step forward, deeper into the trees. The first hour passed uneventfully. The forest was dense but navigable, the terrain shifting between soft soil and jagged rock. Ethan fell into a steady rhythm, his boots crunching against the earth, the familiar burn of exertion settling into his muscles. Then his compass flickered. He stopped mid-step, frowning as he raised his wrist. The digital readout, which had been steady the entire trek, was now jumping between numbers. The directional arrow spun, hesitated, then pointed sharply west off the planned route. Ethan tapped the screen. Nothing changed. A glitch, maybe. He pulled out his GPS as a backup, but as soon as he powered it on, it too struggled to find a lock. The coordinates blinked erratically before the device lost signal altogether. "What the hell?" he muttered. He looked up, gauging the direction his compass was pointing toward. It led off the main trail, into thicker, untouched forest. Instinct told him to ignore it. Technology failed sometimes. He had a map. He could stay on course, but he hesitated. His gut, the same instinct honed over years of exploration, whispered that something was off, that this wasn't just a malfunction. He exhaled, long and slow. Then he stepped off the trail. The deeper he went, the more the atmosphere shifted. The air grew cooler despite the afternoon sun filtering through the canopy. The usual sounds of wildlife faded until only the faint rustling of branches remained. He felt it before he saw it, an odd stillness like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then his boot struck something solid. Ethan stopped, looking down. Beneath a tangle of roots and moss, a flat stone surface peeked through. His pulse quickened. He crouched, brushing away the dirt. More stone revealed itself, smooth, worn, but unmistakably carved. His fingers traced the grooves of an intricate pattern etched into the rock. Symbols, faint but deliberate. A map. The realization sent a chill down his spine. He glanced back at his compass. The arrow pointed straight at it. His rational mind pushed for an explanation. Coincidence. An old marker, maybe, left by long-forgotten explorers. But something gnawed at the back of his mind. As he reached for his phone to take a picture, a sound cracked through the silence. A branch snapping. Ethan's head snapped up, scanning the trees. Nothing. But the feeling remained. An itch at the base of his skull. The sensation of being watched. He straightened slowly, heart pounding. Somewhere, deep in the forest, a shadow shifted. And Ethan was no longer sure he was alone. Ethan crouched lower, running his fingers across the surface of the stone. The carvings were shallow but deliberate, etched by someone who had meant for them to last. The symbols weren't random scratches. They formed a pattern, a sequence, a map. His pulse quickened. He traced the shapes with his fingertips, his mind shifting gears from survival mode to investigative instinct. This was something old, something important. He reached into his pack, pulling out his phone. The camera's flash flickered as he snapped a few shots, capturing the details before rubbing more dirt away. The image of the carvings sharpened, lines connected, forming what looked like a path winding through valleys and ridges. A landmark was marked, a circle at the end of the trail, a destination. He exhaled slowly. His years as a journalist had trained him to recognize patterns, to piece together fragments of a story. This was no ordinary marking. Someone had wanted this route preserved. But why? And who? His compass still pointed directly at it. That's when he heard it. A snap. Sharp, deliberate. His body went rigid. The sound came from somewhere beyond the trees, just past his peripheral vision. He held his breath, listening. The silence was thick, pressing against his ears. Then another shift. A slow, deliberate rustle. Not wind, not an animal. Someone was there. Ethan rose carefully, keeping his breathing steady. He scanned the trees but saw nothing beyond the tangled underbrush. A lifetime of outdoor experience told him that whoever or whatever was nearby wasn't trying to be seen. They were waiting, watching. A chill crept up his spine. His first instinct was to back away, to get out of the area. But then his gaze fell back to the carvings, to the etched lines forming the path deeper into the wilderness. He had two choices: walk away or follow the mystery. His fingers curled into a fist. The compass had led him here. His GPS had failed. His phone flickered in and out of service. None of this was coincidence. He needed to know why. He pulled out his GPS and marked the coordinates. As soon as he tried saving them, the screen glitched, just like the compass. The location disappeared, then reappeared, then froze. A deep unease settled in his chest, but instead of turning back, he pocketed the device, adjusted his pack, and looked ahead. The carvings pointed west, through untouched forest. There was no trail, no signs of anyone passing through here in decades, maybe longer. Another step, forward. Then another. His heartbeat was steady, his mind focused. He followed the map. The forest swallowed him whole. Ethan moved through the underbrush with practiced ease, stepping over roots, ducking under low-hanging branches. The deeper he went, the stranger the air felt, thicker, heavier, as if it was pressing against his skin. The unease didn't fade. The feeling of being watched clung to him, growing stronger with each step. His fingers grazed the handle of his knife strapped to his belt. The farther he went, the quieter the world became. The usual sounds of the wilderness, birds, insects, the rustle of small animals, were absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ethan checked his compass. The arrow pointed forward, unwavering. The map had shown a landmark ahead, a place where the path turned. He moved faster. Then he saw it. A jagged outcrop of stone, jutted from the hillside, half hidden by moss and twisted roots. Ethan slowed, his eyes scanning the area. The rock was unnatural, too smooth, too precise in places, as if shaped by hands rather than time. He approached cautiously, brushing away the layers of damp leaves and vines. More carvings, older than the first. But these weren't just a map. They were warnings. He stepped back, unease gripping his chest, and then behind him, a voice, low, whispered, barely more than wind, his name. He spun. Nothing but trees. His breathing came faster now. Logic fought against instinct. There was no one here. He was alone. Except, he wasn't. Unseen eyes watched from the shadows, waiting. Ethan tightened his grip on his packstrap, and then, despite every instinct telling him to turn back, he took another step forward. Into the unknown. Ethan pressed deeper into the wilderness, his breath steady, his mind sharpening. The strange carvings on the rock formation had left a knot in his gut, but it was the voice, his name spoken in that whispered, wind-like murmur that haunted his thoughts. He told himself it was a trick of the mind, the isolation playing games with his senses. But deep down he knew better. The forest had grown unnervingly still. The usual chorus of birds and insects had disappeared, replaced by a weighty silence that clung to the trees like fog. Even the wind seemed hesitant, stirring, only in fleeting whispers through the canopy above. The path, if it could even be called that, was rough and uneven. He moved carefully, stepping over twisted roots and jagged rocks, his boots pressing into the damp earth. His compass continued to point forward, unwavering, as if something beyond his understanding was guiding him. He no longer questioned why. Then he saw it, a glint of metal half buried in the underbrush. Ethan crouched, pushing aside a tangle of leaves and dirt. His fingers brushed against cold steel, rusted, pitted with age. A canteen. Old. Very old. His pulse quickened. He reached further, brushing away more debris, and found something else. The tattered remains of fabric, the threads nearly consumed by time. Next to it, an old lantern, its glass cracked, its handle eaten away by rust. His breath hitched. This wasn't modern gear. These were relics, from an expedition. His fingers trembled as he lifted the lantern. The design was unmistakably 19th century. Jesus, he muttered under his breath. His gaze swept the ground, searching for more. And then he saw the edge of something rectangular protruding from the dirt. Carefully, he dug around it, his fingers caked with damp soil as he unearthed a leather-bound object, a book. He turned it over, his breath catching as he brushed the dirt from the cover. The leather was cracked and fragile, but the initials stamped into the surface were still visible. Ethan's stomach tightened. He knew that name, Captain Elias Mercer. His fingers ghosted over the worn edges before he carefully pried the journal open. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words still remained. He scanned the first few entries. They were written in an elegant but hurried script. October 3rd, 1889. We have followed the map's guidance for 3 weeks now. The men grow restless. They feel the mountain watching. I tell them it is only the wind, but truthfully I hear it too. A shiver ran through Ethan. He flipped ahead, skimming through Mercer's accounts of the journey. Mentions of treacherous terrain, dwindling supplies, and growing unease among the crew. Then, a passage that made Ethan's blood run cold. Something is wrong. The compass leads us in circles. The men whisper at night of figures moving in the trees. I have seen them too. Shadows where none should be. Ethan swallowed hard. The words could have been his own. His hands tightened around the journal as he read on, his unease growing with each entry. Mercer had led an expedition deep into the Cascade Mountains in search of something. Something he had believed was worth the risk. But the further they traveled, the more his words shifted from confident to paranoid. I no longer believe we are alone. The map has led us here, but I fear it is not a guide. It is a trap. A branch snapped. Ethan's head shot up, the journal clutched in his hands. The forest was motionless, but something had moved. His breath came slow and steady, his eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Then there, just at the edge of his vision, a shape, a figure standing impossibly still, a trick of the light. He blinked. The figure was gone. His fingers curled tighter around the journal. Something about Mercer's words felt too real, too relevant. Ethan inhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. He had two choices, turn back or press forward. He looked at the journal again, flipping to the last entry on the final crumbling page. One sentence, scrawled hastily, a desperate warning. Turn back before the mountain takes you. Ethan clenched his jaw, his decision already made. He wasn't turning back. Not yet. Somewhere ahead, the rest of the story waited. And he needed to know the truth. By the time the sun bled out behind the jagged peaks, Ethan had found a suitable place to set up camp. A small clearing, shielded by thick undergrowth with a rocky overhang to break the wind. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. He worked methodically, setting up his tent and unpacking his gear with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The small flame from his portable stove flickered as he heated a can of soup, but his appetite was weak. The journal sat beside him, Mercer's final words still etched in his mind. Turn back before the mountain takes you. Ethan exhaled sharply and rubbed his temple. No, he wasn't ready to turn back. Not yet. The forest had grown eerily quiet again. Not just the usual nighttime stillness, something deeper. A silence that felt intentional. He took a sip of his, now lukewarm soup, forcing himself to eat despite the unease curling in his gut. He needed his strength. A sound. Faint. Barely there. A rustling just beyond the tree line. Ethan froze, his grip tightening around the spoon. He listened, muscles coiled. Another rustle. Closer this time. He set the can down carefully and reached for his knife, the blade cool in his palm. His eyes flicked to his tent, then to the dark stretch of trees beyond. Something was out there. The fire cast long, flickering shadows, but beyond its reach the forest was an abyss. He strained his eyes, searching. Then, movement. A figure, just at the edge of the trees. Ethan's breath stalled. It was too dark to make out details, but the shape was unmistakable. Someone stood there, still, watching. Adrenaline spiked through his veins. Who's there? He called, his voice low but firm. No answer. He rose slowly, gripping the knife tighter. His mind raced. Could be a lost hiker, could be nothing. But deep down, he knew better. He took a cautious step forward. The figure didn't move. Another step, and then, gone. Ethan blinked. The space where the figure had stood was empty, as if they had never been there at all. His heartbeat hammered in his ears. He scanned the ground. No footprints, No sign that anyone had been there. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to stay by the fire, but his legs moved on their own. He stepped deeper into the darkness. The forest swallowed him whole. The beam of his flashlight cut through the thick shadows, illuminating branches that twisted like skeletal fingers. He moved carefully, senses on high alert. The silence was unnatural, thick enough to make the hairs on his arms rise. Then, footsteps. Not his. He whipped around, light sweeping over the trees. Nothing. But the feeling was undeniable. Someone was near. Following. A metallic glint caught his eye. He crouched, brushing aside a layer of damp leaves. A compass, identical to his. Except this one was rusted, its glass cracked. The needle spun erratically, directionless. A chill crawled up his spine. He turned it over in his palm, his breath hitching as he saw the initials scratched into the back. E.M. Mercer. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just following a mystery. He was walking a path others had already taken. A path they had never returned from. A twig snapped behind him. Ethan spun, heart hammering. But there was nothing there. Just the trees. Just the silence. And the feeling of unseen eyes watching from the darkness. In his palm, the rusted compass spun wildly, matching his own malfunctioning device. Ethan swallowed hard. He had come here for answers. But now, more than anything, he wanted to know if he would make it back out. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ethan woke to the sharp sting of cold air against his face. For a moment he wasn't sure what had startled him awake. Then his senses sharpened and he realized his camp had been disturbed. He sat up, muscles tense. His pack had been moved, his gear shifted, as if someone had searched through it. His knife was still in its sheath, but his compass, his malfunctioning, erratic compass, was lying a few feet away, half buried in the dirt. Someone had been here. A quick scan of the clearing confirmed it. The footprints weren't his. The trail led away from his camp, disappearing into the thick underbrush. Whoever had come in the night hadn't bothered to cover their tracks. Adrenaline kicked in. Ethan grabbed his jacket, pulling it on as he snatched up his knife and compass. He didn't waste time packing up. He followed the trail. His breath came steady despite the cold morning air. The forest was still unnervingly silent, but the unease that had gripped him last night had been replaced by something sharper. Determination. He wasn't alone out here, and he wanted to know who else was hunting this mystery. The trail wasn't long. Less than a quarter mile from his camp, Ethan found her. She stood near a cluster of boulders, her back turned to him, studying something in her hand. He took in the details fast: worn hiking boots, heavy-duty cargo pants, a fitted black jacket with reinforced shoulders. She was tall, lean, her dark hair tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. The gear strapped to her belt was military grade, but her movements were too deliberate, too calculated to be a soldier, a professional then, but not one bound by rules. Ethan knew the type. Before he could speak, she did. "You're quieter than I expected," she said without turning around. Her voice was smooth, measured, the voice of someone who was used to being in control of a conversation. Ethan tightened his grip on his knife. "You want to tell me why you went through my things?" She turned then, and he got his first real look at her face. Sharp cheekbones, intelligent eyes that assessed him in an instant. The corners of her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I was curious," she said simply. Ethan didn't relax. She held something up, a compass, just like his. He stared at it. The needle was spinning wildly, just like his had when he'd found Mercer's journal. His eyes snapped back to hers. "Who are you?" She raised an eyebrow. "You don't know?" He shook his head. She smirked. "Dr. Margaret Graves, but most people call me Maggie." Ethan exhaled sharply. Of course, he knew the name. Margaret Graves wasn't just any historian, she was infamous. She had been expelled from academia for her obsession with lost artifacts, for pushing too far, for breaking too many rules. Some called her a genius, others a thief. And now she was standing in front of him. Ethan crossed his arms. "You've been looking for Mercer's expedition." Her smirk deepened. "For years, and yet, here you are, stumbling onto it by accident." He didn't like her tone. "If you've been searching for so long, how come you haven't found it?" At that, Maggie's expression darkened. She held up her compass again. "Because of this." Ethan frowned. Maggie stepped closer, flipping the device open so he could see the markings inside. "This isn't a standard compass. I had it modified, upgraded, and yet the moment I got close to Mercer's trail, it stopped working. Just like yours, I'm guessing." Ethan hesitated. Maggie took that as confirmation. "Thought so." She glanced at his pack at the journal strapped to the side. "You found Mercer's journal." Ethan didn't confirm or deny it. She took another step closer. "You don't trust me?" "No," he said flatly. She laughed. "Good. You shouldn't." That was the moment Ethan realized what made Maggie different from other treasure hunters. She wasn't just after the prize. She was obsessed. She was too calm, too confident, like she'd already accepted that she would find what she was looking for no matter the cost. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Why are you really here, Graves?" Her smile faded. "Because this isn't just an expedition, Calloway. It's a ghost story." Ethan frowned. Maggie glanced at the trees around them, her expression momentarily serious. Something happened to Mercer's crew. Something beyond bad weather and bad luck. Ethan's mind flashed back to the shadow in the trees, the rusted compass with Mercer's initials, the whisper in the wind. He didn't want to admit it, but she wasn't wrong. Maggie watched him, gauging his reaction. "You can feel it, can't you?" she asked softly. Ethan clenched his jaw. After a long pause, she took a step back and tilted her head toward the deeper forest. "We should work together." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "No chance." Maggie shrugged. "Fine, but we're both heading the same way. And I promise you, Calloway, the deeper we go, the less control we'll have." Ethan didn't respond. Because for the first time since this whole thing started, he believed her. Ethan and Maggie moved in uneasy silence, following the crude path outlined in Mercer's journal. The further they went, the more the forest seemed to change. Subtle. At first, a shift in the air, the light filtering through the trees growing dimmer even though the sun was still high. Then they saw the markings. Ethan stopped first, his hand brushing over the rough bark of a towering pine. The symbol carved into it was fresh, jagged lines, deliberate cuts. Not just scratches, but something purposeful. A warning. Maggie stopped, beside him. "That's recent." Ethan ran his fingers along the groove, his stomach twisting. "Someone's been through here." She smirked. "Or they're still here." He didn't return the expression. The marks weren't random. They followed a pattern, slashes and symbols repeated across multiple trees as they moved deeper into the valley. It didn't feel like a trail marker. It felt like a boundary, a line drawn between what was safe and what was forbidden. Maggie didn't seem to care. "They were close," she muttered, flipping through Mercer's journal. "We're right, on top of their last recorded location." Ethan turned to her. "And what do you think happened when they got there?" Maggie glanced up. "You really believe the ghost stories, don't you?" Ethan's grip tightened around the strap of his pack. He wasn't sure what he believed anymore. But something was wrong here. And someone, whoever had left those carvings, wanted to make sure no one crossed this point. They walked on, their unspoken tension growing thicker with every step. Night came fast. They made camp beneath a rock overhang, the fire between them throwing long shadows across the forest floor. Ethan didn't sleep. Maggie did. Or at least she pretended to. He could tell by the way she lay still, her breathing controlled, waiting. He turned the rusted compass over in his hands. The needle still spun uselessly, as if it no longer cared which way north was. The night was thick with silence. Not even the wind stirred. Then he heard it, a footstep. Slow, deliberate. Ethan went rigid, his fingers curling around the handle of his knife. He scanned the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Nothing moved. Another step. His pulse thundered in his ears. He rose carefully, shifting his weight to avoid making noise, and stepped toward the edge of the camp. His breath was steady, controlled. The firelight stretched only so far. Beyond it, the trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows shifting just enough to make him doubt what was real. Then a voice. Low, measured, right behind him. Some things should stay buried. Ethan spun, his knife raised. A man stood, at the edge of the firelight. Tall, lean, dressed in weather-worn gear, his face half hidden beneath a hood. His presence was unnervingly still, his eyes dark and unreadable. Ethan didn't move, neither did he. A breath passed between them, thick with unspoken warning. Ethan tightened his grip. Who the hell are you? The man's gaze flicked to Mercer's journal, then back to Ethan. His voice, when he spoke, again, was steady, unshaken. Turn back. The flames crackled, the shadows stretched, and before Ethan could react, before he could demand answers, the man stepped backward into the darkness and was gone. Just like that. Ethan exhaled sharply, his chest tight. He turned back toward the fire, his mind racing. Maggie hadn't moved. Either she had slept through it or she had chosen to ignore it. Ethan swallowed hard. He could wake her, tell her what just happened, but he already knew how she'd react. She wouldn't care. She wouldn't listen. So instead, he sat back, down, staring at the fire as the wind finally stirred through the trees. And for the first time since he started this journey, he wondered if he had already gone too far. By dawn, the sky was dark with approaching storm clouds. Ethan and Maggie packed in silence, the weight of the previous night sitting heavy in his chest. As they moved forward, rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier, soaking into their clothes. The wind howled through the trees, forcing them to seek shelter. Then Maggie spotted it, an old abandoned cabin. Its walls were dark with age, its roof sagging under the weight of years. But it was shelter. Ethan stared at it, unease creeping up his spine. Maggie grinned. Looks like we've got a place to wait out the storm. Ethan's gut told him otherwise. But as the rain pounded harder, they had no other choice. He took one last look at the forest behind him. Then reluctantly he followed her inside. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the rotting roof of the cabin as Ethan and Maggie pushed through the doorway. The air inside was thick with damp rot and something else, something stale, like time had folded in on itself and left this place untouched for decades. Ethan ran a hand along the rough wooden walls. Deep gouges carved into the timber sent a fresh wave of unease through him. Claw marks? No, too sharp, too deliberate. It looked more like someone had taken a blade to the walls, slashing at them in blind desperation. Maggie stepped past him, shaking the water from her jacket. Not the worst place I've spent a night. Ethan shot her a look. That's not saying much. She smirked and walked further inside. The floor sagged under their weight, the warped planks groaning in protest. Then Maggie stopped short. Ethan followed her gaze. A body, or what was left of one. A skeleton lay slumped against the far wall, half buried in the debris of a collapsed shelf. The bones were wrapped in the remains of what had once been heavy expedition gear, shredded fabric, rusted buttons, boots long since crumbling. In one skeletal hand it clutched a rifle, in the other a leather-bound journal. Ethan exhaled slowly. Jesus. Maggie was already kneeling beside the remains, her fingers tracing the edges of the book. This guy was part of Mercer's expedition. Ethan stepped closer, swallowing back the instinct to put distance between himself and the bones. Maggie opened the journal, careful with the brittle pages. The ink was faded, the words smudged but still legible. She read aloud. November 21st, 1889. We are lost. The gold was never meant to be found. Mercer doesn't see it, but I do. This place is cursed. Ethan's stomach twisted. Maggie flipped through more pages, skimming over hasty entries, frantic scrawls of a man unraveling at the seams. November 25th, 1889. The others have turned on each other. The hunger is worse now, but it's not just hunger. It's something else. The whispers don't stop. December 1st, 1889. I should have left when I had the chance, but I can't. None of us can. Maggie grinned. This is it. This is real. Ethan looked at her, his skin crawling. This man died here. And you're excited? She turned to him, eyes glinting in the dim light. You're missing the point, Calloway. He wrote about the gold. That means they found it. Mercer found. Ethan clenched his jaw. And it got them all killed. Maggie scoffed. You don't know that. He gestured at the skeleton. Really? What do you think happened here? Maggie didn't answer. She just turned back to the journal. Ethan ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. The unease in his gut had settled into something heavier, something colder. Then he saw it. Footprints, just outside the door, fresh. His grip tightened around the handle of his knife as he moved toward the entrance. The wind howled, but the rain had already begun to ease. The ground outside was soft, the mud thick with impressions. 2 sets of tracks, his and Maggie's, and a third. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. The prints led up to the cabin, but they didn't lead away. Whoever had been standing out there, they were still close, watching. Ethan stepped back inside and closed the door. He didn't tell Maggie, she wouldn't listen. But the feeling in his gut told him one thing. They weren't alone out here. And they were getting closer to something they weren't meant to find. Maggie turned a page, her voice hushed with excitement. There's a map in here, the expedition's final camp. Ethan's stomach twisted. This wasn't over, it was just beginning. The forest grew denser as they pressed forward, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. The path outlined, in Mercer's journal, had long since faded, replaced by nothing but thick underbrush and uneven ground. Yet Maggie moved with purpose, her pace relentless. Ethan lagged a few steps behind, his instincts screaming at him to stop. The journal had led them this far, but something else, something unseen, was pulling them deeper. His compass still, spun wildly, its needle twitching like a living thing. It was useless as a navigation tool now. But every time he considered pocketing it, his fingers tightened around its casing instead. Like it wanted him to keep looking. Like it was leading him somewhere. This is it, Maggie called ahead, her voice cutting through the thick silence. Mercer's final camp has to be close. Ethan swallowed his unease and followed. The terrain grew more treacherous. The incline steepened, forcing them to navigate slick rock and tangled roots. Maggie pressed forward undeterred, her eyes alight with something beyond excitement, obsession. The trees thinned. Then, without warning, the ground fell away. Orge. The mist was thick, swirling between jagged cliffs like breath from something slumbering beneath. The sight of it sent a chill through Ethan's bones. He stepped toward the edge, peering down. The fog coiled and shifted, revealing glimpses of the forest floor far below, strewn with boulders, skeletal remains of trees long fallen. And something else, a shape, half buried in the dirt. Ethan's breath hitched as he climbed down toward it, his boots slipping on loose rock. Maggie was already ahead, crouched beside the object. She brushed away a layer of damp soil and uncovered the full length of an old rusted rifle. But it wasn't the rust that caught Ethan's attention. It was the blood. Fresh. Still wet. His pulse pounded in his ears. Maggie didn't react with fear, only curiosity. She turned the weapon over, examining its make. This is from the expedition, late 19th century. But this... She touched the blood with her fingertips. This isn't. Ethan took a step back. That doesn't make sense. Maggie wiped her hands on her pants. Neither does any of this. But here we are. Ethan scanned the area, his chest tight. The mist curled through the trees, carrying with it something that made his skin crawl. A sound. Low, almost imperceptible. A whisper. His name. Ethan. He turned sharply, his breath coming faster now. The gorge was empty. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, but there was no one there. No one he could see. Maggie had already moved ahead, her focus locked on the trail leading deeper into the ravine. She glanced back at him. "You coming?" Ethan clenched his fists. His body screamed at him to turn back, but his feet, his goddamn feet, moved forward. The compass vibrated in his grip. The needle stilled. It pointed towards something half buried in the dirt just ahead. A skeleton, fingers still wrapped around something gold. Ethan's throat tightened. Maggie's breath hitched as she reached for it, eyes wide. "This is it," she whispered. Ethan's gut twisted. No. This was something else. Something wrong, and they were already too deep to turn back. Maggie dropped to her knees in front of the skeleton, her breath shallow with anticipation. The golden artifact gleamed in the weak light, half buried in the dirt beneath the skeletal fingers. It was no ordinary medallion. The surface was covered in intricate carvings, symbols that matched the ones on the stone map Ethan had found. Symbols that didn't belong to any language he recognized. Ethan took a cautious step forward, his pulse hammering. "Maggie, wait." But she wasn't listening. Her fingers closed around the artifact. The moment her skin touched it, the earth beneath them trembled. A low rumbling vibration passed through the gorge, rattling loose stones down the cliffside. The trees shuddered, their branches creaking under the unseen force. A gust of wind tore through the mist, and for a split second, Ethan swore he heard something buried beneath the wind. Whispers, distant but urgent. Maggie gasped, her eyes widening in awe. She held up the medallion, her fingers tracing its edges. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the key." Ethan swallowed against, the unease clawing its way up his throat. The feeling of being watched had intensified, no longer just a sensation. It was suffocating now, pressing in from all sides. "Maggie, put it down," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. She didn't even look at him. "Do you realize what this means?" Mercer found it. He wasn't just chasing myths. He had proof. This changes everything. Ethan took another step closer. The ground beneath him still felt wrong. "We don't know what we're dealing with." Maggie finally turned to him, and for the first time since they'd met, something in her expression unsettled him. It wasn't excitement anymore. It was something darker. "We're too close to stop now," she murmured, clutching the medallion to her chest like it was the only thing that mattered. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had seen this before. Not the supernatural, no, that was still a battle he wasn't ready to fight. But obsession? The kind that turned rational people blind to everything else. He had seen it ruin lives. Now he was watching it consume Maggie in real time. That night the storm had passed, leaving only an eerie quiet. They had set up camp at the base of the gorge. Maggie had barely spoken since finding the medallion. She kept it close, turning it over in her hands as if it held some kind of power. Ethan sat by the fire, sharpening his knife in slow, methodical strokes. He wanted to believe this was just a case of gold fever, that Maggie was acting exactly like every other treasure hunter who thought they'd found their claim to history. But something about this felt different. He hadn't told Maggie about the whispers. He hadn't told her that when the wind had torn through the gorge, he had heard his own name carried on it. He hadn't told her because part of him still wanted to believe it wasn't real. But then, a sound, soft, muffled. He turned toward Maggie's tent. She was talking. Ethan frowned. She hadn't said a word to him in hours, but now, in the dead of night, she was whispering. Except, he knew the cadence of conversation. This wasn't muttering. It was dialogue. She was answering someone. Ethan rose slowly, knife still in hand. He stepped toward the tent, careful, quiet. Maggie's voice was low, urgent. "I understand now." Silence. Then a whisper. Not hers. A voice too faint to make out, barely more than a breath in the air. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He stepped closer, his pulse a steady hammer in his ears. Maggie's voice again. "No, not yet." Ethan exhaled slowly. He was about to call her name when something caught his eye, carved into a nearby rock, deep and jagged like it had been scraped with a knife. It was never meant to be found. Ethan's throat went dry. He turned back toward the tent. Maggie had gone silent. He wasn't sure what scared him more, that she had been talking to someone who wasn't there, or that maybe, just maybe, someone was. By dawn, Maggie was already moving. She barely acknowledged Ethan as she packed, the medallion tucked safely into her jacket. Ethan's mind was still replaying last night. The whispers, the warning, the undeniable feeling that something unseen had been standing right there in the dark with them. Maggie. She didn't stop packing. "Maggie, we need to talk." She finally looked at him, but her expression was unreadable. "No, we need to move." Ethan exhaled through his nose. "Did you hear anything last night?" Maggie stared at him for a long moment. "I heard a lot of things, Calloway. Most of them telling me we're almost there." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Who were you talking to?" A flicker of something crossed her face. Annoyance? Amusement? "Get your gear," she said instead. She turned, heading toward the trees. Ethan hesitated. He looked back at the rock, the warning etched into its surface. Then he looked at Maggie. Her shoulders were set, her pace steady. And for the first time since meeting her, Ethan realized something. He wasn't sure if Maggie Graves was still walking beside him, or if whatever was waiting for them in the final camp had already claimed her, and was merely leading him there next. The forest had given way to a wasteland. Ethan and Maggie stood at the edge of a ruined campsite, the remnants of Mercer's expedition stretching out before them. Skeletal remains littered the ground, some in makeshift graves hastily dug, others left where they had fallen, their bones tangled together in violent chaos. The air was thick, stale, unmoved for decades. Ethan took a slow step forward, his boot pressing into ground that had once been trampled by desperate men. He could see it now, the final days of Mercer's expedition, the way the bodies were scattered, the half-buried tools, the broken weapons. There had been no orderly retreat. This was a slaughter. Maggie moved ahead, her breathing quick and shallow. Her eyes burned with something that Ethan no longer recognized. "This is it," she whispered. "This is where it happened." Ethan forced his legs to move, each step heavier than the last. He scanned the wreckage, his stomach twisting at the scene. The expedition hadn't simply died here, they had turned on each other. The bones told the story, deep gashes and brittle, rib cages, skulls cracked from blunt force. Some had been buried, but others had been abandoned where they fell, their fingers still curled around rusted weapons. "What the hell happened here?" Ethan muttered. Maggie barely heard him. She was already moving toward the center of the camp, where something loomed in the distance. An altar. Ethan felt his body tense as he approached. It was massive, formed from jagged stone, its surface stained with what looked like dried blood. Maggie exhaled in awe. "It's real." Ethan tore his gaze from the altar and crouched near a partially buried corpse. The tattered remains of a leather-bound book poked out from the skeletal grasp. A journal. He pried it free, careful not to let it disintegrate in his hands. The cover was nearly gone, but the initials remained, barely visible through the decay. E.M. Mercer. Ethan swallowed, hard, and flipped it open. The entries were frantic, the handwriting erratic, as if written by someone at the edge of madness. "We were wrong. This is not treasure. This is not salvation. A debt must always be paid. Ethan turned the page. The last entry was scrawled in jagged, uneven strokes. There is no treasure. Only the cost of taking it. A cold shiver ran through Ethan. Maggie was circling the altar, running her hands over the stone like she could will the answers from it. He took a breath. Maggie. She turned to him, her expression wild. We're close. Ethan held up the journal. This isn't treasure. This is a graveyard. Maggie scoffed. Mercer was losing his mind. He didn't understand what he found. Ethan exhaled sharply. You don't get it, do you? They killed each other. This thing, he gestured to the altar. It did something to them. Maggie shook her head. You sound just like Mercer. Ethan clenched his jaw. Maybe he was the only one who figured it out in time. Maggie ignored him. She was already moving again, circling the altar like a predator. Then she stopped. Ethan. Something in her voice made his stomach drop. He turned to see her crouched near the base of the altar, her fingers brushing against a slab of stone. The ground beneath it was different. Hollow. There's something here, she whispered. Ethan's gut twisted. Maggie, don't. But she was already pulling at the slab, her breath quick with excitement. Stone scraped against stone. A gap appeared beneath the altar, a passageway. Darkness stretched below them. Cold air rushed out, thick with the scent of damp earth and something older. Ethan's fingers curled into fists. This wasn't a discovery. This was a mistake. Maggie turned to him, her eyes wild, her grin sharp. The final camp isn't here, she whispered. It's down there. Ethan swallowed hard. Somewhere in the distance, just beyond the trees, Silas Ward watched, waiting, because he knew what came next, and that it could no longer be stopped. Ethan stood frozen at the edge of the altar, staring into the darkness below. The passage was narrow, framed by ancient stone, its edges worn smooth by time. The air that bled from the opening was frigid, thick with something damp and old. The moment the slab had shifted, the earth had seemed to sigh, like something had been waiting for this door to open again. Maggie exhaled, her breath trembling with excitement. She wiped sweat from her brow, though the air had grown unnaturally cold. We have to go down. Ethan clenched his fists. No, we don't. She turned on him, eyes flashing. Calloway, do you know what this is? This is the last step. Mercer was here. His men were here. They left something behind. They left behind bodies, Maggie, Ethan snapped. And Mercer's own words, this isn't a treasure, it's a goddamn grave. Maggie's lip curled. You can turn back if you want, but I'm going. She didn't wait for him. She pulled out her flashlight, flicked it on, and took the first step down. Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose. This was a mistake, but his feet moved anyway. He followed her into the dark. The descent was slow, the air growing colder with each step. The stone beneath their boots was slick, damp, as if it had been sweating in the earth's belly for centuries. The walls were covered in carvings. Ethan ran his fingers over them as they moved deeper. The images were crude but deliberate. Men with torches, hands raised in supplication. Others bound in ropes, kneeling before a faceless figure, its shape carved into the stone like a void. His stomach twisted. These weren't just scenes. They were warnings. This wasn't a city, he muttered under his breath. It wasn't even a temple. Maggie barely spared him a glance. What are you talking about? Ethan stepped closer to one of the carvings, brushing dust from the grooves. His flashlight illuminated the details, figures stacked atop one another, bound and motionless. The ones above were kneeling. The ones below. His breath caught. The ones below were dead. It's a burial ground, Ethan whispered. This wasn't built to worship something. It was built to contain it. Maggie scoffed. You don't contain treasure, Ethan. He turned to her, his jaw tight. I don't think it's treasure. She was already moving again. Ethan hesitated. He turned back toward the entrance, half expecting to see Silas standing there watching, but he wasn't. Silas hadn't followed, because even he wouldn't come down here. That thought lodged in Ethan's chest like a stone. He turned back toward Maggie, and kept moving. The deeper they went, the worse it got. The walls began to narrow, pressing in like ribs around a heart. The carvings became more erratic. Figures twisting, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes were carved wide, as if they had seen something no man was meant to. Then the whispers started. At first, Ethan thought it was just his mind, playing tricks on him. The wind shifting through the passage, the way sound warped in enclosed spaces. But then he realized. It wasn't just noise, it was words. Soft, low, curling through the darkness like fingers pressing against the back of his skull. His name, Ethan. His breath hitched. Maggie didn't react. She was too far ahead, stepping deeper into the gloom like something was pulling her. Ethan gritted his teeth. He wasn't sure what was worse, the whispers calling him forward, or the silence they left behind. Then Maggie stopped. She was staring ahead, her breath shallow. Ethan came up beside her. The tunnel had ended. They stood at the threshold of a vast chamber, their flashlights sweeping over the expanse. It was filled with gold, piles of it, spilling from the earth like veins of light. Coins, jewelry, artifacts, glinting in the darkness, untouched for centuries. And the bones. So many bones. Scattered across the floor, half buried in dust. Some still clutching weapons. Others curled into themselves. At the far end of the chamber, an enormous stone throne sat against the wall. And on it, a body. Or what was left of one. Draped in what had once been fine clothing, the skeletal remains of Captain Elias Mercer sat slumped against the throne. His skull tilted slightly downward, as if watching over his kingdom of dust and ruin. His journal rested, on his lap, brittle with age. His fingers still curled around the cover. Maggie inhaled sharply. "We found it," she whispered. Ethan's gut twisted. No, they hadn't found anything. They had arrived, just like Mercer had, just like all the others before them. His flashlight flickered. The whispers grew louder. Ethan swallowed hard. Somewhere in the dark, something was waiting. And now it knew they were here. The chamber was vast, stretching beyond the reach of their flashlights. The walls pulsed with the faint glow of phosphorescent fungi, their eerie light casting long, shifting shadows. The air was thick, stale, and laced with the unmistakable scent of decay. Gold was everywhere. Coins spilled across the stone floor, reflecting the ghostly light. Ancient artifacts, chalices, pendants, rings set with gemstones, lay scattered among skeletal remains. The remnants of Mercer's expedition had become part of the treasure hoard they sought. At the far end of the chamber, a massive stone throne loomed against the wall, and on it, slumped in eternal repose, sat Captain Elias Mercer. His body had long since withered, reduced to leathery skin stretched over brittle bones. His clothes, once the fine garments of an explorer, hung in tatters, his skull tilted downward, hollow sockets staring eternally at the chamber's floor. In his right hand he clutched his final journal, and in his left, nothing. His fingers were curled, frozen in time, as if he had once held something. Something that had long since been taken. Ethan swallowed, his stomach twisting. Mercer had not died in battle. He had died watching something, waiting for something. And whatever it was, it had never left. Maggie stepped forward, her breath shallow with awe. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan barely heard her. His focus was locked on Mercer's corpse, the unnatural stillness of it, the way it seemed to be waiting. Maggie moved like she was in a trance, stepping over bones and discarded weapons, her eyes locked on the gold. This was real, she murmured. All of it. The legends, the myths. They weren't exaggerations. Mercer found it. Ethan exhaled slowly, shaking his head. No, Maggie, he didn't. She ignored him, kneeling beside a pile of treasure, running her fingers over a golden chalice. Do you understand what this means? She breathed. This is history. This is proof. The greatest lost expedition of all time, and we found it. Ethan clenched his fists. No, we walked into their grave. Maggie scoffed, but there was something desperate in it, something frayed. Don't start with that. Ethan's jaw tightened. Look around. Do you see the treasure being taken? Do you see any signs that Mercer's men carried it out? They died here. And they died empty-handed. Maggie's fingers curled around a gold coin. That's just bad luck. Ethan stepped closer to Mercer's throne. The skeletal fingers around the journal had stiffened into a death grip, but with careful effort, Ethan pried it loose. The pages crackled as he opened it. The last entry was written in hasty, jagged script. We were fools. This is no treasure. It is a weight, a hunger. It does not want to be taken. It only wants to remain. My men have turned on each other. They hear voices, they see shadows. We should never have come. I should never have led them here. If you have found this, leave now. Leave before it wakes. Ethan's hands went cold. His breath came slower, shallower. He could feel something pressing against him now. The weight of the room. The weight of Mercer's warning. He turned to Maggie. She was holding a golden dagger. The moment her fingers curled around it, the air shifted. A sound, low, guttural, echoed through the chamber. The stone beneath their feet trembled. Ethan's flashlight flickered. His pulse roared in his ears. Maggie, drop it. She turned to him, her grip tightening. We came all this way, Calloway. This is mine. The walls shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling in slow, deliberate streams. Somewhere beyond the gold, beyond the bones, something stirred. Ethan didn't think. He lunged. His hands closed around Maggie's wrist, wrenching the dagger free. She screamed, not in pain, but in fury. As the weapon clattered to the floor, the chamber exploded. A force like a breath from the lungs of the earth itself rushed outward, knocking them both back. The whispering that had been distant before now became screams. Ethan hit the ground hard, gasping for breath. And as he looked up, he saw the impossible. The gold was moving, not rolling, not shifting, sinking, like something beneath it had just awoken and was ready to claim more. The air thickened, pressing against Ethan's skin like the weight of unseen hands. The guttural sound reverberated through the chamber, not an echo, not stone shifting, but something alive. The moment the dagger left the ground, the entire tomb reacted. Maggie's fingers tightened around the hilt, her breath quick with exhilaration. She turned it over in her hands, running her thumb along the gleaming golden edge, oblivious to the way the walls trembled, the gold shifting beneath them like a living tide. Ethan pushed himself up, still winded from the force that had knocked him down. He held Mercer's journal in one hand, his flashlight in the other. The beam flickered as the temperature in the room plummeted. Something was very, very wrong. Maggie, he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. Put it down. She barely heard him. Her eyes glowed with something beyond excitement, something close to reverence. This, she breathed, gripping the dagger tightly. This is what they were protecting. This is what Mercer found. Ethan's heart pounded. No, Maggie, this is what killed them. She shook her head, laughing under her breath. You don't understand. Look at it. It's perfect. It's... She stopped. A tremor pulsed through the cavern. Then another. The entire room lurched. Maggie staggered, barely keeping her footing. Ethan braced himself against the stone floor as dust rained from the ceiling. A crack splintered across one of the pillars, running down like a jagged wound. His flashlight flickered again. The shadows along the walls seemed to shift. Ethan fumbled, with Mercer's journal, flipping through the crumbling pages as the gold around them began to sink. Not collapse, not fall. Sink. Like the ground itself was swallowing it. Mercer's last words burned into his mind as he read, "The treasure is not gold, it is a debt. A price must always be paid." The words shook in his hands as another tremor slammed through the chamber. A crack echoed behind them. Ethan's head snapped toward the tunnel. The entrance, their only way out, was crumbling. The stone pillars holding the passage together groaned under some unseen weight, fractures spreading like veins. Rocks tumbled loose, kicking up, a thick cloud of dust. "No, no, no!" Ethan lunged for Maggie, grabbing her by the arm. "We have to go, now." Maggie wrenched free. "We can't just—" The entire entrance collapsed. A deafening roar of stone grinding against stone filled the chamber as the passage caved in, sealing them inside. Ethan barely managed to throw his arms over his head as debris crashed around them. The dust was suffocating, filling his lungs, burning his eyes. Then, silence. Thick. Absolute. Ethan coughed, dragging himself to his feet. The tunnel was gone. A solid wall of rock now stood where their exit had been. They were trapped. His breath came hard and fast as he turned to Maggie. She was staring at the collapsed entrance, not in panic, not in fear, but in irritation. Like a minor inconvenience had just slowed her down. Ethan's stomach dropped. "You knew," he whispered. Maggie finally looked at him. "What?" Ethan's grip tightened around the journal. "You knew what would happen if you took it." Maggie scoffed, brushing dust from her jacket. "You're being dramatic." Ethan stared at her, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had seen greed before. He had seen obsession. But this was something else. Maggie turned back toward the chamber, gazing at the piles of gold still shimmering under the eerie fungi glow. "We're not trapped. We're just not done yet." Ethan clenched his fists, his breath coming hard. His logical mind, his survival instincts screamed at him to end this, to take the dagger, to kill Maggie if he had to leave her before she dragged him deeper. But before he could move, before he could even process the thought, a whisper, low, cold, from somewhere beneath them, not a gust of wind, not the shifting of the cavern. A voice. "You were warned." Ethan froze. Maggie hadn't reacted. She was still admiring the gold, oblivious to the whisper curling through the air like smoke. He turned slowly, scanning the chamber. The gold was sinking further now, coins vanishing into the dust, as if the floor itself was opening beneath them. No, not as if, it was. Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. They weren't alone. And whatever had been waiting here, whatever had been watching them, it was finally awake. Ethan barely breathed. The whisper, the warning, still echoed through his mind. Then the gold moved. At first it was subtle, a slow sinking, as if the floor beneath it was swallowing the treasure whole. Then the coins shuddered, spilling over one another in waves, shifting like something was breathing beneath them. Maggie didn't notice. She was still fixated on the dagger, running her fingers along the intricate carvings in the hilt. Ethan took a step back. His flashlight wavered, the beam catching strange, elongated shadows along the cavern walls. But they weren't his. They weren't Maggie's. The silhouettes stretched unnaturally, too tall, too thin, moving despite the flickering light. Then one of them stepped forward. Ethan's breath caught. It was shaped like a man, but it was wrong, as if someone had taken a human form and stripped it of all substance, leaving only a husk of darkness. Its head tilted toward him, hollow eye sockets stretching wide, its mouth a sliver of black void. More followed, emerging from the walls, the floor, the gold itself. They weren't ghosts. They were Mercer's men. Or what was left of them. The whispering intensified. A chorus of voices layered over each other, murmuring, pleading. "Ethan, run. No escape. You were warned." Ethan staggered back, his chest tightening. Maggie, still oblivious, let out a triumphant laugh. "You see this?" She gestured at the shifting figures, not in fear, but in admiration. "This place, it's alive. This is proof, Calloway." Ethan tore his eyes away from the figures and grabbed her wrist. "We need to go." She wrenched away from him, her pupils blown wide with something past greed, something closer to devotion. "No," she whispered, eyes gleaming in the dim light. "They've been waiting for us." Ethan's stomach dropped. She wasn't seeing them for what they were. She saw history. She saw greatness. She didn't see the hunger. The figures closed in, whispering in Mercer's voice, in voices that didn't belong to this world. Their skeletal hands reached, and as they did, the gold sank deeper, as if dragging them down with it. The cavern trembled. The walls shifted. The way out was gone. Ethan's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. The only path left was deeper. The figures whispered again, "Come and see." And Maggie, smiling, stepped forward. Ethan had no choice. He followed. Because if he didn't, she was never coming back. The descent into the abyss was a slow unraveling of reality. Ethan followed, Maggie deeper, the air thick with something more than just dust and decay. It watched them, waited. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them into single file. Their flashlights flickered, beams shaking as if resisting what lay ahead. The whispers had quieted, but the silence was worse. It was expectant, a held breath before the final act. Then the tunnel opened. The chamber stretched wide, an impossible space beneath the earth. The ceiling arched like the ribcage of some long-dead beast, stalactites hanging like jagged teeth. The ground sloped downward, leading to the heart of the cavern. A massive altar loomed in the center. Dark stone, slick with moisture, covered in ancient dried blood. And behind it, a mural carved into the rock. Ethan's flashlight traced the images. At first he thought it was a story of conquest. Figures, marching, torches raised. Men digging into the mountain, unearthing treasure. But as he followed the sequence, his gut twisted. The treasure was never taken, the men never left. Figures turned on one another. Some kneeled in worship, others begged. A sacrifice was made, and at the bottom of the mural one image stood out above all. A lone figure, dagger raised, another kneeling, and beneath them, a pit of bones. Ethan's breath hitched. This wasn't Mercer's expedition. This had happened before, again and again, an endless cycle, a debt. And now, it was their turn. Maggie stepped forward. Ethan caught her wrist. "Maggie, don't." She didn't resist, didn't acknowledge him. Her gaze was locked on the altar. She wasn't afraid. She was home. Ethan swallowed, his grip tightening. This isn't history. It's not an archaeological find. This is a trap. She finally looked at him, a slow, almost serene smile curling at the edges of her lips. "I know." Ethan felt the first pang of terror in his ribs. "Then stop. We need to leave." "I see it now, Ethan." Her voice was soft, distant. "I see what Mercer saw." Ethan's flashlight flickered. His pulse thundered. Then from the darkness, a final whisper. "Choose." Ethan turned. The shadows had gathered at the edges of the chamber, watching. Their forms rippled, shifting between men and something else. The whisper came again. "Choose." Ethan understood. Mercer had stood here, like this, faced with the same moment, the same choice. One must die. One must live. The debt must always be paid. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Maggie smiled at him. "It's okay, Ethan," she whispered. She lifted the dagger. "I see it now." Ethan's fingers closed into a fist, and the mountain waited. The cavern throbbed, a slow and rhythmic pulse that seemed to echo through the very bones of the mountain. The whispers had become deafening now, layered voices, fractured and insistent, pressing against Ethan's skull. He gripped the dagger, its golden hilt ice cold in his fingers. The weight of it felt wrong, not just the metal, but what it represented. The mural loomed before him, the last image burning into his mind, one standing, one kneeling, one walking free, the other left behind. It was never about gold. This place fed on choices, and it was demanding one from him now. Ethan's breath came hard, ragged. His pulse thundered in his ears. Across from him, Maggie stood at the foot of the altar, her posture eerily calm. The dagger's twin, the ancient blade she had pried from a corpse, hung loosely in her grip. She smiled. "You don't have to be afraid, Ethan," she whispered. "It's already decided." Ethan shook his head, his fingers tightening around the weapon in his hand. "No, that's not how this works." Maggie took a slow step forward. "You feel it, don't you?" she murmured. "The weight, the pull. It's always been here, waiting for us." Ethan fought the rising panic in his chest. He thought of Mercer, of the bones surrounding them, the countless men who had stood here before, each thinking themselves unique, only to fall into the same pattern. Mercer had stood where Ethan was standing now. He had held a dagger just like this one, and he had chosen wrong. Ethan exhaled sharply, eyes flicking to the collapsed tunnel. There was no way back. The mountain was forcing his hand. The whispers swelled, rising like an unseen tide, pleading now. End it. Do what must be done. It's the only way. Maggie tilted her head. Her pupils were dilated, her expression almost serene. This is how it has to be. Ethan's chest tightened. No. Her smile didn't falter. You don't understand yet, but you will. She opened her arms, inviting him. Inviting death. Ethan's grip on the dagger trembled. Could he do it? Could he strike her down just to survive? Was he any different than Mercer? The whispers grew frantic. The chamber tightened around them, the air collapsing inward. Choose. Choose. The dagger burned in Ethan's grip. His hands shook. His pulse raced. Maggie smiled, and Ethan let go. The dagger clattered against the stone. The whispers screamed, the air fractured, and the mountain roared. The cavern screamed. The walls trembled, fractures webbing across the stone as dust and debris rained from the ceiling. The whispers, once coaxing, had turned to furious shrieks. Ethan barely had time to register the shift before Maggie moved. She lunged, the golden dagger flashing in her grip, her face twisted with something beyond rage, beyond humanity. Ethan barely dodged, stumbling backward as the blade sliced through empty air where his throat had been. "Maggie, stop!" She came again, faster, stronger. Her blows were feral, each strike aimed to kill. Ethan blocked her wild slashes, his arms burning with the force of it. She was faster than she should have been, stronger than she should have been. Her eyes were wide, but they weren't looking at him. They were looking past him, at the altar, at something else. "You ruined it," she hissed. Ethan ducked a strike, barely rolling away in time. The ground beneath them heaved, the very mountain rejecting them. "This is bigger than you," Maggie snarled. "Bigger than both of us. It was supposed to be you." Ethan's heart pounded. She wasn't Maggie anymore, not really. She had become part of this place. Just like Mercer had. Just like all of them had. Another strike. Another near miss. He blocked with his forearm, pain searing through his nerves as the dagger sliced shallow but deep enough. She was going to kill him. And then behind her he saw it. A flash. A flicker of movement that wasn't hers. Another fight. Another man centuries ago, locked in the same struggle. Mercer battling his own men, his own friends, the dagger in his hand, their blood on his hands. Ethan's stomach twisted. This had happened before. This had happened 1,000 times before. And every time, every single time, the cycle had won. Not this time. Not again. Maggie lunged. Ethan didn't dodge. Instead, he stepped into her attack, his hands clamping around her wrists. Her breath hitched, eyes widening. For the first time, something flickered through her gaze, something that looked like clarity. Her grip weakened. Ethan's voice was low, steady. It's not fate, Maggie. Her fingers trembled against the dagger. Her breath shuddered. And then, the cavern roared. A final deafening crack split through the air as the ceiling began to collapse. Dust and rock pummeled down. The mountain was coming down. Ethan didn't think. He ran. He bolted for the only visible passage, the only exit left. Behind him, Maggie turned, her eyes locked on the altar. One final whisper, low, hollow, echoing inside his skull. It was never meant to be taken. Then, the altar shattered, and Maggie was gone. Ethan ran. The cavern was dying, the very walls cracking apart as the mountain roared in fury. The sound was overwhelming. Stone grinding against stone, the air filled with dust. Gold coins clattering and vanishing into the widening abyss beneath his feet. The path ahead was barely stable, shifting under his weight as he fought forward. His lungs burned, his vision blurred, but he kept running. Behind him, the whispers twisted into an inhuman howl. Maggie wasn't running. Ethan risked a glance over his shoulder, heart hammering. She stood at the altar's edge, dagger loose in her hand, her expression unreadable. The shadows coiled, around her feet rising like mist, like hands reaching to pull her down. She smiled. "I understand now," she whispered. Ethan's stomach twisted. "Maggie, move." She shook her head, her gaze distant, peaceful. "We were never supposed to leave." The ground split. A crack erupted beneath her, the earth swallowing the altar, the throne, the bones, the gold, everything. For the briefest moment, Ethan thought she would move, would fight. But she didn't. The shadows consumed her. And then, she was gone. Ethan threw himself forward, lungs screaming just as the final collapse began. Rocks crashed down in a deafening cascade, the tunnel behind him imploding, sealing itself in a suffocating avalanche of stone and dust. He felt the heat of it against his back, the force of the collapse nearly dragging him down with it. He stumbled, legs shaking, barely clearing the exit, and then silence. Ethan landed hard on the rocky slope outside, his body breaking against the jagged terrain. The cold air hit him like a slap. He coughed, dirt and blood in his mouth, his pulse hammering. The entrance was gone, buried, sealed. The mountain had claimed its own. Ethan's entire body trembled, his chest rising and falling in desperate, uneven gasps. The whispers were gone. The mountain was quiet. The cycle had ended. Ethan rolled onto his back, staring up at the sky. For the first time in what felt like centuries, he could see the stars. He had made it out. But Maggie hadn't. And as his vision blurred, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion, he heard it. A voice. Low. Steady. Real. Calling his name. Ethan. His breath hitched. He tried to sit up. His body refused. The last thing he saw before everything faded to black. A shadow standing at the edge of the tree line. Watching. Waiting. Then, darkness. Ethan drifted between waking and unconsciousness, his body pinned by exhaustion, his mind slipping through layers of fog. He could still feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on him, the whispers still clawing at the edges of his thoughts, though they were fading like a nightmare dissolving at sunrise. The air was cold, crisp, real. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving toward him. Ethan forced his eyes open. A shadow loomed over him, tall, unmoving. The form was familiar, silhouetted against the pale morning light filtering through the trees. For a moment, Ethan tensed, instinct screaming at him to run. Then the figure stepped closer. The light shifted. Silas. Ethan exhaled sharply, barely managing to keep his breath steady. The silent guardian stood over him, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes scanning Ethan as if assessing him. Ethan knew what he saw. A man who had walked the edge of something ancient and hungry, a man who had chosen and survived. Silas watched him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he knelt. Ethan's gaze flickered downward, his pulse slowing, as he saw what Silas held in his hands. The golden dagger, the last artifact. The thing that had nearly cost Ethan his life, that had cost Maggie her life. Silas had found it among the rubble. And now, Silas buried it. He pressed it deep into the earth with steady, calloused hands, covering it carefully, methodically, as if sealing away something poisonous, something that should never be touched again. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself up onto his elbows. His entire body ached, but he barely noticed. He watched as Silas finished, the dirt packed firm, the dagger now just a ghost beneath the soil. It was done. The past, buried. Again. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a shaking hand over his face. His voice was rough, his throat raw. "How long have you been doing this?" Silas didn't look at him. For a second, Ethan thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice low and quiet, he spoke for the first time. "You're the first to leave." Ethan's breath stalled. Silas stood, his face impassive. No satisfaction, no relief, just acceptance. As if this had always been his role. To watch, to wait, to bury what needed to be buried. Ethan stared at the fresh earth, unease curling in his chest. The mountain had taken what it wanted, but it had let him go. Why? When he looked up again, Silas was gone. The trees swallowed him whole, leaving Ethan alone in the clearing, staring at the buried dagger. He sat there for a long time. Then finally, he stood and walked away. Ethan walked. His body screamed for rest, but he didn't stop. The forest blurred around him, the trees stretching endlessly, their silent forms whispering against the wind. The weight in his chest remained, a pressure that hadn't lifted since the mountain let him go. His boots crunched over damp earth. His breath came slow, measured. He had survived. But at what cost? Then, a sound. Shrill, mechanical. His satellite phone. Ethan froze. For a moment, he just stared at it, barely believing it was real. The screen was cracked, mud caked around the edges. But somehow, it still worked. And Jacob was calling. Ethan swallowed, his fingers shaking as he pressed accept. "Ethan?" His brother's voice hit like a gunshot. Familiar, anchoring. Ethan exhaled slowly, his pulse struggling to find its rhythm. "Yeah." His voice was rough, nearly unrecognizable. A beat of silence. Then Jacob exhaled, hard. "Jesus Christ, man. Where the hell have you been?" Ethan's mouth went dry. How long had he been gone? He glanced up. The sky was too bright, the sun too high. His body told him it had only been days, but something else, something deeper, whispered otherwise. Jacob's voice sharpened. "Ethan, you there?" He forced himself to respond. "I got lost." A hollow excuse. A lie, but not really. Jacob let out a strained laugh, half relief, half frustration. "No kidding. Your GPS was all over the place. Then it stopped for almost 3 days. I thought you were dead." 3 days? Ethan's stomach twisted. It had been longer than that. He knew it. He could feel it in his bones. Jacob continued. "We sent out search teams. You dropped off the grid, man. I was about to call in favors." Ethan swallowed hard. He could hear the worry in Jacob's voice, the frustration masking raw panic. He should tell him, should explain everything. But as he stood there, staring at the tree line, staring at the distant peaks that still loomed behind him, he knew he never would. Some things should stay buried. "I'm okay," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I just needed to get back." Jacob exhaled long and shaky. "Yeah, okay. Where the hell are you?" Ethan looked ahead. The dirt trail stretched toward civilization, toward normalcy. "I'll find my way," he muttered. Another pause, then softer. "You always do." Ethan ended the call, He shoved the phone into his jacket, exhaling through his nose. One step forward, then another. He was walking away, leaving it behind. But as his fingers brushed against his pocket, he felt something crinkle. A single tattered page. Mercer's final words. His breath caught as he pulled it free, the old paper worn, the ink faint but still clear. I hope someone finds this. If you do, run. Ethan stared at the words. His pulse slowed. He clenched the paper tight in his fist, and he kept walking. Far behind him, deep in the mountains, the forest remained silent, the earth settled, the past buried, and in the ruins beneath the rock where no one could see, a rusted compass lay half buried in the dirt. Its needle twitched. Then, ever so slowly, it began to spin. The end. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.